A satellite hijacking that folded not over weeks, not over days, but in 47 minutes. 47 minutes that paralyzed military GPS across Eastern Europe. 47 minutes that triggered the immediate relocation of the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff to undisclosed hardened locations. 47 minutes that prompted Ukraine to intercept what analysts are now calling an apocalypse signal, a coded transmission sequence consistent with nuclear readiness protocols. What the Kremlin did crossed a line that every Western defense planner had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, Ukraine did not hesitate. They responded with speed, precision, and a ferocity that caught even their allies off guard. For months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic communications, just signals that Russia was preparing something fundamentally different. Russia has been aggressive, yes, but they have been calculated in their aggression. Their moves have followed a certain rhythm, a predictability, almost a choreography that intelligence agencies had learned to read. But what set off alarm bells at NORAD, at the Pentagon, and in Brussels this spring was that the rhythm went silent. Analysts who monitor Russian space activity know the indicators, the movement of mobile ground stations, the repositioning of electronic warfare aircraft, the sudden surge in encrypted traffic between Moscow and Plesetsk Cosmodrome, the diplomatic cables that stopped mid-conversation. All of that went quiet 3 weeks ago. And whenever the Kremlin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. The silence was deafening to those who knew what to listen for. Satellite imagery showed unusual activity at Russia's Space Command facilities. Ground-based radar installations were being reinforced. New antenna arrays appeared at sites previously believed dormant. Intelligence officers began referring to it internally as the pause before the storm. They were right. Early on the morning of April 14th, United States Space Command detected what they described as unauthorized access and manipulation of military-grade satellite infrastructure, including interference with the GPS-3 constellation that had not been attempted, let alone achieved, in over 15 years. These are the kinds of capabilities that Russia only deploys when they're signaling something very specific, strategic escalation, direct provocation, or preparation for kinetic conflict. NATO observers didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its posture in ways that defied conventional interpretation. And when a nuclear-armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by the smallest measure, every intelligence agency on the planet pays attention. The hijacking wasn't subtle. Within minutes of the intrusion, military navigation systems across Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states began reporting catastrophic errors. Aircraft received false positioning data. Naval vessels lost lock on their coordinates. Ground forces saw their tactical systems display locations that were miles from reality. It was, in the words of one Pentagon official speaking anonymously, a complete compromise of the electromagnetic battlefield. The warning issued by the Pentagon and White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official, following classified briefings that ran through the night, described Russia's move as unprecedented in scope, destabilizing in intent, and perhaps most importantly, operationally actionable, meaning this wasn't posturing, this was preparation. But coercion only works if the target hesitates. Ukraine did not. In fact, their response today was among the most aggressive and precisely executed we've seen in the entire course of this conflict. Here's what we know. Within 90 minutes of the satellite hijacking being confirmed, Ukraine launched a coordinated series of strikes that stunned observers. These weren't the standard drone operations we've grown accustomed to. These were Tier 1 deep strike missions, systems and assets that Ukraine only deploys when they are preparing to fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. Sources indicate that Ukrainian forces activated previously dormant signal intelligence networks across occupied territories, networks that had been planted months earlier and were designed specifically for this scenario. Tonight, Ukrainian military intelligence confirmed that Special Operations Forces launched precision strikes on Russian command infrastructure, including a satellite ground control station in Crimea that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was exactly this kind of operation. Ukraine struck before Russia could activate backup systems. They hit the primary relay station at Yevpatoria. They hit the mobile command vehicles positioned near Sevastopol. They hit the underground bunker complexes at Jankoy that were likely preparing to coordinate the next phase of the satellite warfare campaign. In other words, Ukraine targeted the nervous system of Russia's space-based electronic warfare capability, the infrastructure that would have made the hijacking sustainable. This is what made the Pentagon's warning so urgent. Russia's satellite hijacking wasn't just symbolic, it was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could blind NATO forces across an entire theater if left unchecked. And Ukraine, understanding that fully, responded with overwhelming force, not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't strike population centers. They didn't hit symbolic targets for propaganda value. They hit the ground stations. They hit the relay nodes. They hit the command architecture that made the hijacking possible. According to intercepted communications, Russian commanders on the ground were caught completely off guard. They had expected days, perhaps weeks, before any meaningful Western response materialized. They had 47 minutes, and here's where the story becomes even more alarming. U.S. intelligence officials now believe that Russia's satellite hijacking was designed to test the cohesion of the NATO alliance after months of internal political fractures and shifting electoral landscapes. Russia wanted to see whether the West would fragment, delay, or defer to diplomatic channels while they consolidated their advantage. But instead, the opposite happened. Ukraine didn't wait for NATO authorization. They launched a counterstrike that was so swift, so precisely targeted, that even the Kremlin noticed. You don't get Russia's attention easily when they're in the middle of an offensive operation. But today, Ukraine did. Senior defense officials speaking with Western media under anonymity described Russia's satellite hijacking as pressure testing, a way to identify cracks in the alliance that could be exploited later. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and unpredictable. Their strikes were not only accurate, they were calibrated so precisely that Russian backup systems couldn't activate before the primary nodes were destroyed. That timing matters because it shows Ukrainian intelligence had penetrated Russian operational planning to a degree Moscow didn't anticipate. It shows that Ukraine is not waiting for permission to defend the battlefield. They are shaping it. As reports continued coming in throughout the night, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian cyber units carried out simultaneous attacks on Russian satellite communication networks, forcing emergency shutdowns at 3 ground facilities. NATO space monitoring assets tracked and identified mobile command units that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours, providing real-time targeting data. Special operations forces operating deep behind Russian lines reportedly disabled the encrypted relay systems used by Russia to coordinate the hijacking sequence. This wasn't just retaliation, this wasn't just defense, this was systematic dismantling, this was strategic denial. And strategic denial is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early months of this war. For every technological advance they have made, Ukraine has countered with something that neutralizes the advantage before it can be consolidated. Remember, Russia thought this war would last 3 days. They thought Ukraine would collapse under the initial shock. They thought NATO would fracture under economic pressure and public fatigue. They thought time was on their side. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Ukraine is striking deeper into Russian-held territory than at any point in the conflict. NATO is more unified in its response than it has been in decades, and Russia is more isolated, more overextended, and more vulnerable than at any point since 1991. The satellite hijacking was supposed to demonstrate Russian technological superiority. Instead, it demonstrated their desperation. What makes this moment so dangerous and so revealing is that Russia's satellite hijacking happened at a time when Vladimir Putin is under extraordinary internal pressure. Military hardliners want escalation and are pushing for tactical nuclear demonstrations. Pragmatists in the security services want a negotiated settlement before the economy collapses completely. Oligarchs want sanctions relief and are quietly funding opposition research. And the military leadership wants territorial gains to justify the catastrophic losses they've sustained. Putin is balancing these demands while simultaneously managing a war that has cost Russia over 400,000 casualties and depleted their conventional forces to a degree not seen since World War II. And when leaders in that position make sudden dramatic moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. The satellite hijacking wasn't a show of power. It was a gamble by a leader running out of options. The Pentagon's formal statement, now distributed to every NATO command, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to tolerate unchecked Russian aggression in the space domain. Defense officials said plainly that Russia's satellite hijacking was inconsistent with responsible behavior in shared orbital and electromagnetic environments. That is diplomatic language for this is an act of war and we are preparing to respond accordingly. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something genuinely serious is at stake. The Joint Chiefs, now operating from hardened locations across the continental United States, have reportedly been in continuous session since the hijacking was confirmed. Their absence from public view is itself a signal, one that Moscow cannot fail to notice. Meanwhile, Ukraine's President Zelensky addressed the nation in a somber, defiant speech tonight. He said, "They tried to blind us from space. We answered from the ground." He said, "Every system they used to wage war against us will be destroyed. Every command center, every relay, every bunker." And he said, "The world is watching what happens next. And the world will see that Ukraine does not wait to be saved. Ukraine saves itself." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become and who is willing to act on that understanding. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Russia's satellite hijacking wasn't isolated. Along with the primary attack on NATO navigation systems, Chinese surveillance vessels also repositioned near undersea cable infrastructure in the Pacific. Belarusian forces conducted surprise readiness exercises within striking distance of the Polish border. Iranian-backed proxies increased cyber attacks targeting Western energy infrastructure. All of this happened within the same 72-hour window. When Russia moves multiple pieces at once, and their partners move with them, it means something larger is underway. Intelligence analysts are now working around the clock to determine whether this represents coordinated action or opportunistic alignment. Either way, the implications are profound. Western analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Russia is preparing for a full satellite warfare campaign designed to neutralize NATO's technological advantages ahead of a major ground offensive. Another is that Russia is attempting to create a communications blackout zone that would allow them to operate without Western surveillance. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Russia is attempting to establish conditions for nuclear signaling, using the apocalypse signal that Ukraine intercepted as a warning to NATO to back down. But today, Ukraine took that card off the table. They didn't wait for diplomatic clarity. They didn't defer to Allied consensus. They didn't accept the role of victim. They struck first, struck hard, and struck with precision that demonstrated capabilities Russia didn't know they possessed. What we're watching now is a test of resolve, Russia wants to see whether the West will fracture under pressure when the battlefield extends into space. Ukraine wants to show that they can fight and win in any domain Russia chooses to escalate into. The United States wants to prevent this crisis from spiraling into direct NATO-Russia conflict, and Europe wants to prevent the economic and humanitarian catastrophe that would follow a wider war. All of these objectives are now in tension. All of them are being tested simultaneously. Tonight, we've heard from intelligence sources who are now monitoring Russian command traffic in real time. They say Russian forces are in assessment mode, trying to determine the full extent of the damage Ukraine inflicted. They say there are indications of confusion at the highest levels of Russian military command about how Ukraine achieved such precise targeting. And they say Russia's decision to hijack NATO satellites is likely part of a broader strategy intended to demonstrate that the West is not untouchable, but that strategy appears to have backfired catastrophically. Ukraine is not cowering. In fact, Ukraine is pressing their advantage. Their response today, swift, devastating, and precisely targeted, sent a message to Russia that there are no safe spaces in this conflict, and it sent a message to NATO that Ukraine remains their most capable and determined partner. As the coming days unfold, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Russia hoped to achieve with this satellite hijacking. But what we do know is that the Pentagon's warning was timely. It unified Allied messaging before Russia could exploit divisions. It provided political cover for Ukraine's aggressive response, and it signaled to Moscow that the space domain is not a grey zone. It is an extension of the battlefield, with all the consequences that entails. What happens next will depend on what Russia does in the next 48 to 72 hours. If they escalate further, this moment will be remembered as the beginning of a new and more dangerous phase of the conflict. If they pull back, Ukraine and NATO have already shown they are prepared to press the advantage. They have shown they are ready to respond at every level. Tonight, for the first time since the invasion began, Russia appears to be recalculating. The Kremlin is quiet, too quiet. And when Moscow is quiet after an operation goes wrong, it means they are reassessing. It means they are choosing their next move carefully. Because tonight, Russia learned something they should have understood years ago. Ukraine does not wait for rescue. Ukraine does not accept the terms of conflict their enemies prefer, and Ukraine does not lose the initiative, they seize it. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: the satellite hijacking that was supposed to demonstrate Russian dominance instead revealed their vulnerability. The apocalypse signal that was supposed to intimidate the West instead galvanized the response, and the Joint Chiefs who vanished from public view did so not out of fear, but to coordinate the most significant recalibration of Western defense posture since the Cold War. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.